Next item is a resolution affirming the Village of Park Forest commitment to establish and implement a race equity and leadership plan. Mr. Manager?
Mayor and Board, this item comes out of the Manager's Office and also comes from the Race Equity and Leadership Steering Committee. Mayor, I'm sure you're going to elaborate on this agenda item, but I think it's important that kind of a little bit of the background. The National League of Cities developed the Race Equity and Leadership Program based on a number of incidents that took place across the country, and I think they started with Race Equity and Leadership in 2015, 2016. Of particular note, they developed a municipal action guide that offers several steps that municipalities, that if they want to get involved with developing a race equity and leadership program, they can consider. And in many respects, I think we've hit a number of those already with what we're doing with our community meetings, our steering committee, our subcommittees, et cetera. But one thing we haven't done is actually taken an official commitment, and that's what's before the board this evening. Everybody on the board is aware that since the mid part of 2016, we've really gotten underway with race equity and leadership activities in Park Forest. It started with a community stakeholder program that took place in the boardroom. I think we had about 40 people on hand for that meeting. And from there, a couple months later, there was an appointment of a 9-person board that comprised the steering committee. There were also 3 subcommittees that were then put together above and beyond that, with focuses being on policies, procedures, and programs or practices. And then there was also a directive given to the Commission on Human Relations for them to begin a community-wide lecture series. And I believe 3 of those programs have taken place since then, really aimed at getting to a dialogue along the lines of race and also facilitating public discussion, not just presentations, but interactive dialogue with the community. So all the work that's been done, I think Park Forest is probably at the fore of a lot of communities across the country as far as its efforts that go with race equity and leadership. But one of the things we haven't done when you look at that municipal action guide is to make a public declaration. And so that's what's before the board tonight, and it's basically reaffirming our commitments, and I think in the eyes of everybody on the board now, there is that commitment to continuing the work of race equity and leadership. But the thought is to set that tone and codify it going forward so that the commitment lives, not just, for the next 6 months, but for the next 6 years, the next 10 years. And I think, Mary, this may steal a little bit of your thunder, but I think the thing that really crystallized in your mind the thought we needed to do something with Park Forest was just the striking similarities between us and Ferguson. And Ferguson, Missouri really had some unfortunate circumstances, but when you look at that community compared to Park Forest, eerily similar in size, demographics, location to a larger urban area. And as we think about it in Park Forest, we've done some really neat things, and I think the resolution speaks to that. Having a Commission on Human Relations that's been around for 50 years plus. The good work that commission does, community relations coordinator, community relations director we've had over the years. Our neighborhood meetings programs, I think, go a long way in continuing the dialogue with the public. But if you're not continuing to be proactive, you're only a step away from something like that happening in our community. And so the thought was to really take a closer look at Park Forest and not just rest on our laurels. And I think that's the work that the 3 subcommittees in the Race, Equity, and Leadership Steering Committee have been working on since then. So the resolution that's before the board this evening is just a commitment for us going forward. And with that, Mayor, I would defer to your comments.
Well, first of all, are there any questions or comments from trustees this evening about this? Then let me just say a couple of things. I think Tom has really characterized it very well in terms of what the goals are and the purposes behind the real program that the National League of Cities has initiated and our level of involvement in it. I think one of the things that came out of the analysis of some of what was occurring in some of the cities around the country that was done by NLC staff was that there had been underlying things that had been festering for a long time in most of these communities, and nobody ever did anything to really address them. And in many cases, it was not an intentional kind of thing. It was just something that had been there, and it continued to be there, and it just lingered and lingered, you know, to the point of where individuals in the community did not have the same opportunities in some cases as, you know, as their fellow citizens did on the basis of race. And I think, you know, as Tom mentioned, I think there's a lot of things that happen in Park Forest that help to alleviate us heading in that direction. But you can't be comfortable based upon what you did, you know, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. You know, in 1959, the first African-American family moved into Park Forest. Part of what we have to do in terms of addressing our situation is to recognize the reality of what our situation has been. And the reality of our situation is, even though people have been inclined to think to the contrary, in the initial days of Park Forest, there was racial discrimination in our community. African Americans could not rent from American community builders in the initial days of the community. They could not buy a home anywhere in the community. Asian residents could rent, but they couldn't buy a home in any of the area that was developed by American community builders. They could buy a lot and build their own home, and Harry Tashima, who became probably the greatest catalyst for racial equity being established in our community in the early days, whose family had suffered in a Japanese internment camp in California during World War II, Harry actually was not able to buy a home, so he bought a lot, and he built a house on that lot in Park Forest. But this existed in our community. It was discrimination. When the first African-American family moved into Park Forest on Christmas Eve, 1959, and it was not a municipal effort that brought that about. It was effort undertaken by a social action committee of the Unitarian Church. The Unitarian Church at that time was located in Chicago Heights, but a lot of Park Foresters were active in the Unitarian Church. And the Social Services Committee of the Unitarian Church was the group that took the initiative to, number one, identify residents who were willing to sell their homes to an African-American family, and number two, to find a family that was willing to move into Park Forest. And the first family that moved into Park Forest was a gentleman who was a professor at DePaul University. Now, what's interesting is that, you know, when you talk about racial equity and attitudes and things, some of the language that was used in attracting the professor to move into Park Forest is just a crystal clear example of the lack of racial equity, because the point was made repeatedly to residents of the community that this was a gentleman who was college educated, who was a university professor. In other words, had somebody been a factory worker, they would not have been given that same opportunity to move into the community. So that in and of itself is an indication that even when there were efforts being made to integrate the community, there was still a level of discrimination and inequity that was taking place. So, and the other side of it is that, you know, I think we have long been kind of under the impression that it was a very welcoming situation, but there were circumstances where not that welcoming. There were citizens of the community who did object to an African-American family moving in. Fortunately, the objection was not like it was in Cicero and other places where there was, for all practical purposes, riots that took place. But there were objections. There were candidates who ran for trustee who campaigned specifically on the point that, you know, they were opposed to the integration of our community. There were people who ran for the school board, specifically as their campaign being opposed to the integration of our community. So we have to understand that we did the right thing, but that didn't mean that there weren't elements that were at play during that time that were less than equitable. okay? Among some of our co-ops, there were some co-ops that were very embracing. In fact, Myrtle Martin tells the story about how she went to rent at the rentals and was turned down. They wouldn't rent to her, but they recommended she go to Area J, and she went to Area J, and she got a unit. But while Area J was renting to African Americans at that time, or giving them the opportunity to become shareholders in the corporation as a co-op, my co-op, Birch Street Townhomes, which was Area B at that time, it was discriminating against African Americans who tried to become residents. So we have a history that has a lot of spots in it that we can't gloss over. We can't pretend that everything has been hunky-dory since that first family moved in. That was not the case. There was a lot of good effort that was put forth by a lot of good people to make sure that things went smoothly. Henry Deach, Anthony Scariano, Bob Dinnerstein, who was the mayor at the time, they all worked very diligently to make sure that things were as smooth as possible. But the fact of the matter is, we do have those points in our own history that we can't be ignorant of, because when you're ignorant of things, that just leads to the potential of problems along the way. So, where we are today, however, we have made a concerted effort to maintain as level of a playing field for all of our residents as is possible. But we have to be aware of the fact that if there's an area that is unlevel in our community right now, it very well probably applies mostly to newer residents coming into the community. Some of that is because of the newer residents, some of it is because of the existing residents in Park Forest. Newer residents are not as familiar with the way things have been done in Park Forest, as we all say at different times, and so they're going to be less inclined sometimes to do those things that we all take for granted from being around for a while. And also, if they experience discrimination in other communities, they're going to bring with them in Park Forest a feeling that they're probably going to be discriminated against here too. And so we have to be conscientious about that. That's the reason for things like the Human Relations Commission forums, so that we can give people the opportunity to air those concerns and we can talk them through. But the basic point of us making a commitment to work on race, equity, and leadership is that we recognize that there's a constantly moving target. Things don't stay the same. And so as we progress and as we have changes in our community, we have to make sure that we make a commitment that we're going to try to the greatest extent possible as a municipal effort to make sure that everybody who's in our community has a level playing field when it comes to employment, when it comes to how they're treated in regard to tickets that may be issued for building code violations, any one of a number of different things. And while we're doing that principally based upon race with this initiative, we also have to realize that there are other segments of our community that we must be conscious of and make sure that we don't have discrimination taking place on the basis of gender preference, on the basis of sexual orientation, on the basis of age, any one of those kinds of things. And so, I guess our commitment as a village, if we adopt this resolution, which I'm hopeful that we will do at our next meeting, our commitment is that we're going to actually develop a plan so that we can constantly be on top of things. If you're not constantly looking at things, it's very easy for things to slip in, and they just start to be that way. And so by putting together a plan, we will be making a commitment to keep our eyes open going forward and looking at the language that we use, looking at policies that we put into effect in terms of relationship to our employees, looking at how we handle adjudication on violations that come about either as a result of police tickets that are issued or building code tickets, et cetera, so that we always maintain to the greatest extent possible a level playing field for all of our community. I want to just express thanks to the members of the steering committee, because the steering committee's been meeting on one Monday night a month for the last well over a year, talking through some of these things. We spend a lot of time talking, but we tried to talk through some of these things and enlighten one another on some of the issues, and I think that's been very good. Our Mayor Pro Tem, Trustee Brandon, serves on that. Trustee Graham serves on that. They represent the board. From the staff, we have Rob Gunther and Hildy Kingma and Chief Menino and the village manager. So they are the 4 staff representatives. And from the community, we have Elfrida Keller, who is the chairperson of our Human Relations Commission, and Ricky Williams, who is the vice chair of the Cable Commission, but Ricky also brings to the table several years of experience working with youth organizations in the Chicagoland area, and is very insightful on a number of issues as they relate to race and youth. And so, you know, we also have a couple of student members who, because of the college students, because of their college schedule, are not able to meet with us as frequently as we would like, but we're looking at maybe trying to expand into maybe some high school students that would also give us that student perspective. But it's the kind of thing that if you don't make a commitment to do it, it won't happen. So that's what this resolution does, is makes a commitment. So with that, we will have this on the agenda for action at our May 18th meeting?
March 18th.
March 18th. I'm jumping the gun on May, right? On the March 18th.
Don't rush it.
All right, very good.